Hi, I'm Leah Rauch, Director of Education at Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center. On behalf of our CEO, Susan Abrams, our board of directors, volunteers, and staff, I would like to thank you for being here for our program with David G. Marwell, featuring his new book, Mengele, Unmasking the Angel of Death. The mission of Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center is expressed in our founding principle. Remember the past, transform the future. The museum is dedicated to preserving the legacy of the Holocaust by honoring the memories of those who were lost and by teaching universal lessons that combat hatred, prejudice, and indifference. Before we begin, I want to give a special thanks to our community partners listed at the start of the program. And now I will turn it over to the museum's manager of public programs, Raheem Thompson. Raheem?
Thank you, Leah. And thank you everyone in attendance tonight. I appreciate your support. This is going to be a great program with Dr. Marwell. How are you today, Dr. Marwell?
I'm very well. Thanks very much, Raheem.
Yeah, do you have any opening remarks for our audience before we get into the program?
No, I simply wanted to say how pleased I am to have been invited to do this program. I'm a big admirer of your museum, and I'm looking forward to having you grill me with probing questions.
I'll take it easy on you, no worries.
All right.
Well, let's get into it. After graduate school, you started your career in the Department of Justice in the Office of Special Investigations, which focused on identifying and persecuting Nazi war criminals. Can you talk about that experience and your work as a historian investigator and how those experiences introduce you to Mengele?
Sure, be happy to. It's a part of my past that I like talking about very much. While I was still working on my dissertation, for those of you who have gotten PhDs and written dissertations, you know that it's a very lonely and isolating process. And at some point before I was finished, I decided I needed to get out in the world. So I applied for a job with the government and was working in another agency with the General Services Administration when I read about a new office that was being established in the criminal division of the Justice Department called the Office of Special Investigations, which was charged with identifying and prosecuting Nazi war criminals living in the United States who had persecuted innocents during the war. Rather than to try them for their criminal acts, our jurisdiction allowed us to try them for immigration fraud. So basically it was an immigration violations that we were going after. It was the only way that we could actually call them to account for the crimes they had committed. The theory is that they had failed to disclose what they had done during the war and therefore obtain their immigration by fraud. So we started, and I got a job as a historian there. At the beginning, historians were simply, we were hired to translate documents and to explain some of the history to the attorneys. But at some point, it became clear that the crimes that we were working on and investigating were really complex. They took place an ocean away from where we were sitting in our desks in Washington. And they involved a history that had been really forgotten, except for those who had lived it and those who studied it. And so we emerged from being essentially document translators to investigators. And we helped to establish what I have called the field of forensic history. I think it was the first time that professional historians, or those who were studying to be professional historians, were full-time members of the prosecution team. So we interviewed witnesses, we located documents, we briefed the lawyers, we found experts and briefed them. In some rare cases, we'd also testify in court. And it was a very interesting and stimulating process to be part of that. At some point, our normal fare was to go after people who had helped the Nazis in their persecution, either as camp guards or as translators or as policemen. But in 1983, the Attorney General then under President Reagan asked us to investigate the allegations that a certain Klaus Barbie, who was a notorious war criminal who had served in the Gestapo in France, there were allegations that he had helped the United States intelligence somehow after the war. and that he'd been complicit, had been an agent for us. And so we were asked to investigate that. That was a kind of special investigation, and I was assigned to that case. And a few years after that, we were also asked by the Attorney General, then it was Ed Meese, to investigate allegations that that Joseph Mengele had in fact also been used by the United States. And that investigation actually transformed into a manhunt for him, where we were joined by the German government and by the Israeli government and by another office in the Justice Department, the US Marshal Service, in an active investigation to find Mengele and to bring him to justice.
Absolutely. And you also mentioned in a previous interview that after your work was done, Mengele kind of stuck with you. What about him intrigued you, and why did you decide to press move forward?
Yeah, so I had I mean, the investigation actually lasted a long time. It's a long story, which I tell in the book, because when we began the investigation, it turns out that Mengele was already dead. He had died 6 years before the investigation actually began. And the investigation kind of transformed itself into a forensic investigation once a body was found in Brazil in 1985. And we were charged with determining whether the body was actually Mengele's or not. And that was a very complicated process, which involved a lot of investigation and a lot of medical forensic work. I left the department in 1988 to go to Berlin to become the director of the Berlin Document Center. And you know, the experience of having investigated Mengele, having you know, visited his hideouts, going to the scenes of his crime, interviewing his victims and those who survived, talking to experts, and in the end, actually holding his bones in my hand, had a kind of powerful effect on me in a way. And I thought about Mengele as a figure and as a symbol, and I started to talk about it in public. I talked about our investigation, and when I left my last job, which was as a director of a museum in New York City, I was asked what was I going to do, and I just almost instinctively or impulsively said, well, I'm going to write a book about Joseph Mengele. So that's when the real work started. And I initially thought I would write a book about the investigation, to talk about my role in it and a kind of memoir. But the more I read about Mengele, and the more background I read, and the more of the recent scholarship that had been produced about Mengele since I had last studied him some 30 years before, I became convinced that I had to broaden my project, and not simply to write about the investigation. That certainly be part of the book, but I should try to talk about who Mengele was and who he wasn't, because that was one of the challenges in writing about Mengele, because he had emerged so powerfully as a figure in public culture, popular culture. Anyone who's seen The Boys from Brazil or The Marathon Man or any of these various films, or seen the play The Deputy or read novels where Mengele becomes a kind of central figure as the epitome of evil, he took on a role of being a kind of, I've described it as a malign metaphor. If you were looking for the essence of evil, you would compare someone to Mengele. And so my challenge extended not only to talking about who he was, but to talking about who he wasn't, and to kind of strip away some of the myths that had attached themselves willy-nilly to his persona. And so that's what I set out to do, which is a very difficult task, especially when many of the beliefs held about Mengele are very, very closely held and difficult for people to step away from them in some ways. But I realized in writing the book that even though I was demythifying this man and stripping away a kind of what I described as a kind of caricature of a kind of grotesque figure, what we were left with was something that I believed was even more unsettling than that caricature, which was the man himself, and the fact that he was a human being who had human emotions and also human motivations. And I tried to kind of parse that and figure out what it was all about.
Yeah, and you can tell from the first approach in the book, like the first half is pretty much like biographical in terms of you're like debunking a lot of the myths of Mengele. And I wanted to know, could you talk about who he really was, even like before, like towards the end of the war? Can you tell us some of the things you discovered about him that's actually not as publicly known?
Yeah, so a lot of people characterize Mengele as a kind of mad scientist. He's become a kind of metaphor for that. In fact, you know, since the pandemic, I've noticed that I had set up a Google alert when I started working on the book. Anytime Mengele's name was mentioned, in the press or anywhere on the internet, in the blog or anything, I'd get a notification, and I would get one or two a day, almost every day on average, at least one or two a day, almost every day. Since the pandemic, I've gotten sometimes 7 or 8 of them, because Mengele becomes the benchmark when they're talking about the evils of when some people are talking about the evils of vaccinations and vaccine, and they bring up Mengele when they're talking about a particularly evil figure, depending on what their politics are. Mengele becomes the comparison. So that's kind of how he was known, at least in the popular literature. When I started reading about him, and I read, I was surprised to find that he had an elite education. He had earned a PhD in anthropology and another advanced degree, another PhD in a sense, in medicine. So he wrote 2 dissertations, both of which I've read. I read all of the scientific articles that he published, and he was on track to become, probably would have had a productive and well-known career in German medicine. I mean, he was kind of on the vanguard of German science. He was well respected, and he engaged in this science, and he received this elite education at the very time that the Nazis took power. And then when the Nazis assumed power, they gave the science that Mengele studied, which was racial science, anthropology and medicine, but with a focus on physical anthropology and race. They gave that new science a new status, more funding, higher status individually for people who pursued it, because that science provided an ideological basis upon which Nazi ideology was based. Rudolf Hess, who was the deputy Führer, once said that National Socialism or Nazism was simply biology enacted. It was really applied biology, and Mengele equipped himself to be a kind of soldier in this kind of racial war that the Nazis had conceived of and later pursued through his scientific studies and his interests and his pursuits. But this was not simply someone who was politically motivated, although he had a passion and an interest for the science itself. And that surprised me. I didn't realize the extent of that. And there are a number of other kind of biographical details that have either been misstated or misunderstood in talking about Mengele. His military career, for instance, is usually passed over very quickly. And I was able to kind of detail his movements from before the war actually began until he went to Auschwitz. And he was really involved in frontline combat, kind of extreme violence for a very long, sustained period of time. And his unit was involved in some mass violence at the beginning of the war and probably later. So he began, you know, in the first days of the Operation Barbarossa. His unit was not on the front line, but they crossed into the Soviet Union a few days after Operation Barbarossa began, and they were involved in a string of kind of mass executions. And he was involved without interruption until January of 1943, when he was evacuated. His unit was covering the retreat from Stalingrad, and he was evacuated to Berlin. And from there, he was assigned to Auschwitz a few months later.
Yeah, and speaking of misunderstanding, you had said what we know about Mengele is more trope than truth. And could you explain what did you mean by that? But also, at one point, were you a believer of those tropes? And as you learned through the years, what part of that changed? And what is the truth? What do you consider truth?
Well, so that's a very good question. And yes, I was a believer in that. And what I'm about to say all rests on a few things that must be understood. Number one, and most of when I talked about what we know about Mengele is more trope than truth, it has to do with what he was doing at Auschwitz. The exact nature of his experimental work that he did there. Mengele was a camp physician at Auschwitz, and he was his major assigned duties were really represented, I think, the most significant of his crimes, which was to be involved in the selection of newly arrived individuals, of inmates when they arrived at the camp, deciding who should be murdered immediately and who should be exploited first for their labor before being murdered. So this so-called selection, and he carried that out without hesitation. It was a duty that many people, at least allegedly, found difficult, at least at the beginning. Mengele kind of took to it, and although he didn't do it alone, and he didn't do it necessarily more often than other people, but he did it in his normal assigned routine. He was also involved in doing selections in the camp itself after people were registered, trying to cull the camp population of those who were no longer able to provide effective labor, and those who were too sick or represented a threat to the public health of the SS population because of illness and epidemics. So that was his main activity. In addition to that, Mengele set up in a sense, a kind of research institute at Auschwitz. He recruited, and I say recruited with air quotes. You imagine that when he was there, probably 750,000 people arrived at Auschwitz during the period that Mengele was assigned there, and among those people were some of the best prepared, the smartest, and the most able and experienced scientists and physicians that Europe had to offer. And so Mengele was able to select not only people who were going to die right away and people who would be exploited for the labor, but he also was able to find people who could assist him, not willingly. And they were given a kind of choiceless choice about whether to cooperate with him. But he would find pathologists and pediatricians and medical draftsmen and nurses and anthropologists and a whole range of people who could assist him in his scientific work. He also was able to find a huge number of potential subjects of investigation, of experimentation. He sought out primarily twins, because twin research was considered the gold standard for genetic research at the time, not only in Germany, but all over the world. There were some 200 dissertations done based on twin research in the 12 years of Nazi rule in Germany. Some of the research was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. It was not inherently a evil or grotesque enterprise. It was the way one could tease out whether a particular pathology was the result of genetics or of environment. And Mengele, so twins were extremely important subjects of investigation. And Mengele was able to find a huge supply of them at Auschwitz who came off the trains, and he segregated them into an area, and he conducted his experiments on them. What we don't know is exactly what he did. We don't know the nature of his experiments. There are no records that have survived of Mengele's experiments, very, very few. All we have is the testimony of individuals who either witnessed them or who were subjected to them and who survived. The best witnesses, obviously, of his experiments didn't survive, and so that we can't ask them the question. Those who did survive, we're not really in a position to know what Mengele's scientific interests were. They know what happened to them, and they could speak authoritatively, even though many of them were children and many of them were traumatized. They could say, well, he took my blood, or he did this to me, or he did that to me, but they don't know what the goal of the experiments were, or what Mengele was trying to prove. And that provides a significant challenge to anyone who's trying to understand what he was trying to do in terms of his science at Auschwitz. So in the book, I with the help of lots of brilliant new scholarship by historians of science and historians of medicine, mainly in Germany, tried to isolate the areas of his interest. And I do that in the book, talk about the 5 or 6 areas that he was interested in and that he pursued.
Yeah, and throughout this process of, kind of challenging these tropes, did you find it challenging both professionally and personally to write about Mengele?
I did. I mean, I know it was uncomfortable for me to challenge some of the myths because they're, as I said, very closely held and believed. I mean, one of the first thing, if you ask nearly everyone, what was Mengele trying to do with his experiments on twins, you will receive the answer. And there's reasons for this answer. It doesn't happen, in my view, to be true, but that Mengele was trying to discover the secret of twin births because he wanted to understand twin births so that he could increase the birth rate of German children, of Nazi children. So he wanted to stimulate the expansion of the Nazi German population. And that's simply not true. It ignores the fact that twin research was already an established and respected protocol for genetic research. It also, it seemed to me, to ignore the fact that if you're interested in what made people have twins, you would be interested in the people who had twins, not in the twins themselves. You'd be interested in the parents of twins. And Mengele showed no particular interest in examining the parents who had twins. He was looking at the twins themselves. And so that's one of these myths that there's another myth that you'll hear about, is that Mengele was trying to change the eye color of children by injecting blue dye into the eyes to change make a brown eye blue, to make them more Aryan in appearance. Well, that simply isn't true either. I mean, Mengele wasn't interested in doing cosmetic changes. He was trying to figure out, from his point of view, more profound things about race. He was involved in research about eye color, but it had to do with the impact of certain hormones on eye color. The eye color was always a puzzle for geneticists because there's so many different factors that can contribute to the color of eyes. And he was working with a scientist, so-called scientist at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin, who was studying eye color and was interested particularly in those individuals who had 2 different color eyes, so-called heterochromia. And there were a number of people at Auschwitz, a number of children who had this condition. And Mengele helped to identify those kids and also eventually to after they were killed, to have their eyes removed and sent to Berlin to be studied by his colleague Karen Magnuson, who was conducting this research. So it doesn't make it less bad, but it does explain that there was a kind of, in the context of the time, a scientific motivation for the work. And we know that Mengele did apply, he didn't inject dye into eyes, but he, with a dropper would drop probably adrenaline into the eyes to see its impact on the color of eyes. Because one of the theories was that adrenaline would have an impact on eye color. And this was a very frightening and painful experience for the children, but it wasn't what people thought it was.
As you were beginning the process of writing this book and you were discovering things about Mengele, was there anything that you learned about him that surprised you? And if so, who did you consult with as you were writing this book, you know, as you were uncovering things?
I think that what surprised me most was his education and the seriousness of his engagement, and how well he was received by the scientific establishment at the time. That surprised me, that he was really a legitimate scientist in training, and that in the context of the time was kind of an overachiever and quite well respected, and with the prospect for a probably pretty significant career in the fields of his study. I didn't realize that, and the other thing I think was I didn't realize how little we knew about the science that he did, the experiments that he did carry out at Auschwitz. That because we know that he tried to save his records. We know we have witnesses who saw him pack up his notes and samples when he evacuated Auschwitz in January of 1945. And we have some idea that some of them made their way to South America with him. But so few survived that it's difficult to reconstruct on the basis of those of his records. What we have is, we have some progress reports that were sent to the German funding institution, the Foundation for Research, that funded some of his research. So we have some of the progress reports written to them, and we have some of the testimony of some of the inmate physicians who worked with him. So I think we're able to reconstruct responsibly at least the broader scope of his research activity. And I make the point in the book that in some ways, I think it's easier for us to relegate Mengele into the mad scientist role, because it's easier in a way to accept that there are people who are so aberrant in their view of the world and in their own personal motivation, and we place them over there. That's Mengele. But if you think about him as as I say in the book, both the product and the promise of the scientific establishment in Germany, it's a much more frightening picture that he was a representative of a much larger kind of institutional structure, and also that, I think a lot of people too easily, well, I'll put it this way: Mengele was a convinced ideologue. He believed in what he was doing. There's no question about it, and he wasn't remorseful.
And you mentioned before that even though there were reports that Mengele, his body had been found dead, there were some suspicions that if it was actually his body. And while you were working the case, you convinced your boss to continue the case. Why did you convince him? And you talked about the crucial evidence that you found that helped close the case. What was that?
So I have to give a little bit of background here, just to. So the body, Mengele died while swimming on the beach on the coast of Brazil in 1979. He had a stroke, and so he either died from the stroke or he died from drowning because he was swimming when he had the stroke. The body was then buried under an assumed name, under a false name, in a cemetery on the outskirts of Sao Paulo in Brazil. And it rested there until the German police raided the house of a Mengele family confidant, a former executive in the Mengele family firm, and found correspondence that led them to believe that Mengele drowned 6 years before. This was in June of '85 when this correspondence was found during the police raid. And the Germans then went directly to Sao Paulo to investigate the discovery of the body. We went down a few days later. I actually went maybe 10 days after the body was found. And so what was a manhunt then kind of switched into this forensic investigation. And at that time, you have to retrace your steps a little bit in terms of the forensic science. In 1985, DNA was not a forensic tool. It was being looked at as a potential forensic tool, but the crucial technique of PCR hadn't been invented yet. And in order to do so-called DNA typing or DNA fingerprinting, you needed a lot of high quality, high molecular weight DNA to do that analysis. And the body that was found in the grave was just a skeleton that had been in a burial container that had been was of poor quality. It was in a wet environment. There was no soft tissue left, so there was no ability to do fingerprints or to find scars or any other identifying factors. There was a little bit of scalp hair and mustache hair. The clothing was there, but in very bad shape. And the rest were just bones and very few teeth in the mouth, which was the traditional way of identifying a body if you had good comparative documents. So the assembled teams of forensic experts, there was a team from the United States. We actually had two teams from the United States, probably 10 forensic scientists, anthropologists, pathologists, odontologists who studied teeth, a forensic radiologist, and forensic anthropologist. And the Germans sent a team, and the Brazilians had their own team, they had their own forensic institute. The Israelis did not send anyone, but they sent a friend of mine who was a Israeli police officer. And they all examined the bones, and 2 weeks later they said, well, we think the body is Joseph Mengele, and they used the standard of within a reasonable scientific certainty, which is a kind of, in our view, at least my view at the time, was a kind of a made-up standard in a way, because you don't really know what that means. And the body didn't have evidence of what was believed to be a condition that Mengele had suffered from when he was living. So there were at least some reasons to believe that the examination, the conclusion that the body was Mengele's, wasn't firm enough to really satisfy a really passionate public. And when I got back from Brazil in the middle of June or late June 1985, I went to my boss and I said, with another colleague, and we said, look, they may be right. In fact, I think they're right. I think it is Mengele, but it's there's just not enough evidence to make it clear and convincing in our view. We think we need to go on. And what's most frustrating is there's a lot of new evidence that was discovered in Brazil when the body was found. There's correspondence, there were notebooks, there were even phonograph records of Mengele speaking. There was a autobiography that Mengele had written in the form of a novel that hadn't been seen or before. And I knew that when infamous people die, especially under circumstances that aren't known, that all kinds of questions arise. It's just a natural phenomenon. Marilyn Monroe, John Kennedy, Elvis Presley, people jump to speculate about why they died, and all kinds of theories emerge. And I believed that we owed it to the survivors, and we owed it to ourselves and to history, not to be too rosy about it, to make sure that we had the best possible case, whether it was Mengeles or not. So to his credit, my boss said, yes, you continue to investigate it, but I don't want any publicity, and I want it to be quiet. And so then we started kind of in earnest. I went to Germany. I went through all the records that had been recovered by the German police, or that the Sun had, and evaluated them, and was able to assemble a pretty detailed memoranda about all of the medical treatment that Mengele had received in the last several years of his life, medical and dental treatment, because it was all reflected in his diaries, which hadn't really been carefully reviewed. And then about a year and a half after the body, almost 2 years after the body was found, we went back to Brazil. Two guys from German police, two guys from Israel, one from the Mossad and one from the Justice Ministry. And I went back to Brazil, armed with the research that I had done about this medical treatment. And we went back and we found a lot of evidence. We found the dentist who did a root canal on him. We found another dentist. We found a surgeon who performed a surgery on him. And we found records that, in my view, really made the case. They really settled the case, in my view. That was in April of 1986. The case wasn't actually formally closed until April of 1992, when the science of DNA as a forensic tool advanced to the point where it could be used to identify the body of Mengele. That they advanced the extraction of DNA from bones, and were able to replicate that DNA through this PCR process, so that you had enough that could be analyzed through the electrophoresis process that they use. And so in April '92, they were able to, I think by any standard, prove that it was Mengele. But for me, once we finished that kind of secret trip to Brazil in 1986, I was convinced that the body was Mengele.
Wow, well, that's some extensive research right there.
Yeah.
And how did you stay focused throughout that whole process? Because I'm sure there was some uncertainty at that time too, or were you just convinced right away and you just had to convince others?
No, I wasn't convinced that the body was Mengele's. I think until we found that evidence, some dental X-rays and other things in April of '86. But it was a very kind of diplomatically and psychologically a very complicated case. We were involved, and this wasn't a routine case at all. I mean, we were involved, the Department of Justice. We were involved with the German prosecutor's office in Frankfurt, and the German federal police, and the German police from Hessen, which is the German state where Frankfurt is located. And we were involved with the people from the Israeli intelligence agency, although they weren't identified as such, and the Israeli Justice Department. And we agreed when we went into this rather complicated international effort that we would all close the case at the same time. There wasn't going to be any kind of one country closes and another doesn't. I mean, the German prosecutor told me correctly, I think, no one's going to believe a German DA in Frankfurt that Mengele is dead if the Israelis don't agree. And the Israelis were reticent to sign on to the identification of the body. It really was their insistence that we explore the possibility of using DNA that led to the kind of really confident closing of the case. They couldn't bring themselves, even though the evidence, in my view, was by the end of '86 was overwhelming that the body was Mengeles. They simply couldn't leave any stone unturned, and they really waited. And in the ultimate irony, of course, the science that motivated and animated Mengele developed to the point where it could help also put to rest the question about whether he was dead or not.
All right, I have one last question. Then
Okay.
we can get into the audience Q&A.
Good.
The paperback version of your book released last month. First, I want to say congratulations on that.
Thank you.
And in hindsight, is there anything you would add or omit from the original copy of the book?
That's a very good question. It's interesting when you write a book that gets kind of wide exposure, people write to you. And over the course of the year and a half that the book came out initially in January of 2000, right before of 2020, sorry, right before the pandemic. Great timing for releasing a book. I heard from a lot of people. I heard, for instance, from the very talented British scientist who was able to actually extract the DNA from Mengele's bones and was successful in that. She attended one of my talks that I gave in London. I heard from the wife of the German anthropologist or pathologist who had invented this technique for comparing the skull with photographs of Mengele. I heard from a lot of other people. So these things add to your understanding. I don't think that I would change any material facts in the book. I mean, I don't think that my conclusions have been shaken by any of the stuff that I've learned since the book came out. Although one of the central theses about Mengele as myth was actually supported, as I mentioned before, by the kind of public reaction to the pandemic and now to the vaccinations. I would, if I were to do another edition of this or something, I might write a new introduction where I kind of think about that issue and how Mengele was invoked as this kind of model of the kind of anti-scientist throughout the pandemic. There's a front page of a newspaper in Athens, a right-wing newspaper that has a picture of Albert Bourla, the president of the head of Pfizer, and there's a picture of Mengele right next to him, and they're making the comparison between the Pfizer CEO and Joseph Mengele. And it happens every day. If you just go on and if you query Google with Mengele vaccine or anything like that, you'll see a whole load of references. So I think that's an interesting thing that's happened since the book came out. But I'm very gratified. And the book just came out in not just, but earlier in the year, came out in Germany, and I was really interested in what the response would be in Germany. And so far, it's been very well reviewed, and I've gotten some very thoughtful letters about it. So I'm quite pleased by that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for answering my question, and congratulations again.
Thank you.
And yeah, so we have some time, so let's get into the audience Q&A. And the first question, do you think there are so few surviving records of Mengele because he intentionally destroyed them? Was he only interested in identical twins, or did he ever use fraternal twins?
So I know Mengele may have destroyed them once he got to Brazil. I mean, he tried to save the records because he was interested. He didn't know when he left. He left Auschwitz in late January or mid-January of 1945, and he had another assignment at another concentration camp, but eventually was taken prisoner by the Americans, was in a POW camp for a while, in fact, 2 POW camps, and then was released. And I go into that in some detail in the book, and then was a farm laborer for about 3 or 4 years in Germany before going to South America. And he went to Argentina in 1949. And we think, or I argue in the book, that he took some small number of records with him. We don't know exactly what it was, but there's talk in his autobiography about a small case that had some medical, either specimens or records. And we know that he wrote an article in a German language publication in Buenos Aires in 1953 that, and we know also that he invested in a pharmaceutical company in Buenos Aires in 1957, and kind of was gearing back into into his passion, which was science. So he didn't destroy the records, as far as we know, intentionally. He really wanted to keep them because he wanted to pursue what he was studying. When he died, the records weren't found. So he may have destroyed them once after Eichmann was kidnapped and Mengele really went on the run, went underground more than he had been. He may have destroyed them then. I forgot the last question I wanted to answer, but I can't remember what it was. The second part of that question was, about twins. Mengele was interested both in identical and in fraternal twins, because the two types of twins offer two different answers to a question that the science posed. Most of this twin research, or much of it, was related to pathology, to disease. Was disease inherited, or was it a part of, or was it nature, or was it nurture? And if you had identical twins, have essentially the same DNA. It's not always expressed in the same way, but they one egg divides and the same DNA is in both sets, both pairs of an identical twin set. Fraternal twins have the same DNA as siblings would have, the same kind of convergence, or the two sets of a fraternal twin pair would be like brother and sister. It's not identical. It could be as much as 50% or less. It depends on chance. So, but one thing that fraternal twins have that brothers and sisters don't have is that they have an identical environment until the time of birth. They're in the womb together. They have the same experience, intrauterine experience, and they're essentially raised, if they're together, by one family with the same kind of nutrition and the same kind of child rearing techniques. So if you're studying one particular disease and you find that among identical twins, there's a high concordance, that is, a huge number of identical twin have the same disease, then you would posit then that disease is somehow genetically linked. If you don't find that, but find in fraternal twins that there's a huge concordance between twins who have that disease, then you could suggest that it was more something that was caused by the environment and not by. So that's the use of both fraternal and identical twins they were used together by twin researchers. And one of the big challenges for twin research at the time, and still a little bit sometimes even today, is trying to determine whether twins are identical or fraternal, which was not as easy as it sounds. It certainly wasn't then. And much of what Mengele was doing, at least according to the testimony of twins who have survived, most of the twins who survived were, survived because the war ended. Most of what they're reporting about what happened to them was part of this protocol to determine whether they were identical twins or whether they're fraternal twins, which included tremendous amount of measurements and taking blood and doing a plaster cast of the teeth to compare systematically whether they were identical or fraternal. And a lot of the testimony from twin children at the time really reports on that procedure that was done to them.
Next question. Did you have any contact with Mengele's descendants or family in writing the book?
I didn't want in writing the book, but during the investigation in 1985 and 86, I met Mengele's son, Rolf. He initially was quite helpful on the investigation, and we went to see him in his office. At that time, he was an attorney in Freiburg in Germany. I went there with my boss. We tried to get him to help us with his father, the physician who had been his father's physician when he was a child, to see whether he would help us get records or whether there's anything, because when the body was first found, we had to build up a kind of library of what we knew about Mengele in life, any accidents he had had, any diseases and all of that. So we were looking for information from Mengele's childhood physician to see whether they had any records. And Mengele's son helped us with that effort. He later became more recalcitrant and even refused initially, once the DNA was located, was identified for Mengele, he refused to submit to a blood test so that his DNA could be compared with his alleged father. But he finally relented. So I met him, and I met kind of surreptitiously Mengele's wife. She was also an important witness because she knew whether Mengele, we were interested in whether there were some testimony that Mengele limped. So we wanted to know whether her memory of her, this was Mengele's first wife, whom he divorced in 1940, in the mid 50s, but he left her in 1949 when he went to South America. We wanted to know whether he limped when she knew him and whether he had any scars and all of that. I didn't talk to her directly, but one of my colleagues who was a native speaker, a woman who kind of befriended her on the telephone, and I was on the other extension kind of scribbling questions to ask her. So I met her kind of that way. And we were scheduled to meet his second wife, a woman with whom he lived in South America. We were scheduled to meet her in the South Tyrol, in Murano, in Italy. But right before we arrived, she decided to not to meet with us. And I did meet Mengele's nephew, the son of his brother, whom I met before the investigation began, when he had checked into a hotel in Miami Beach. He checked in with an old man, and we got a call from someone in the Jewish community in Miami Beach saying there's a guy named Mengele checked into the Fontainebleau Hotel with an old man. So I went down with one of our investigators, and we questioned both Mengele's nephew, who turned out to be, and the old man, who turned out not to be Mengele.
Man, I can only imagine the rush that could have been. Just curiosity.
Yeah.
Okay. There's been a lot of speculation, but has anyone figured out who helped him escape?
Well, there's not a huge mystery about how he got to South America. I mean, he came from a very wealthy family, a very prosperous family, that owned a farm machinery factory in a Bavarian small city, and they had a lot of money and they had some influence. And when Mengele left in 1949, he really was aided by his family's money, and there were a huge number of people who made their way from Germany through Austria over the Brenner Pass into Italy, and then to the seaports in Italy to find their way to South America. And there was some of them were Nazi war criminals. We know about the so-called rat line, but some of them were simply refugees who had nowhere else to go. And Mengele joined in that kind of flood of people. He had a much more comfortable time, because whereas Adolf Eichmann stayed on the dirt floor of a monastery or something like that while he was waiting for the papers to be fixed, Mengele stayed in a very nice hotel. And but that's how he got out. It wasn't that difficult. It wasn't that difficult to get the papers, to get the Red Cross identification, and to if you had the dough, and he did.
Yeah. What did Mengele do after the war? What was his life like in Brazil?
So just to review quickly, his first few years after he left Auschwitz, he lived under an assumed name after being released from American captivity, under an assumed name as a farmhand, doing very heavy manual labor, and he didn't like it very much. He did that for a few years, and then he decided that it was really that he really had no future in Germany. This was around the time of the so-called subsequent proceedings at Nuremberg, the doctor's trial, denazification in Germany, which was an attempt to identify those who had contributed to the formation of the Nazi state, and other things. And so Mengele, really in some ways convinced by his wife, decided that he had to leave. So he left behind his wife and his then 2 or 3 year old son, and he made his way to South America. And there he found, Buenos Aires was a very welcoming environment. Argentina, the leader welcomed and provided a kind of benign environment for Nazi emigres and others. And Buenos Aires was a very cosmopolitan city with libraries and theaters and bookstores and a pretty active German-speaking community. And Mengele joined in that also under an assumed name. For the first period of time that he lived there, he hid his identity. But in 1956, after traveling under this assumed name to Germany and visiting his family and some former colleagues and seeing his son for the first time as a young adult, as a 12-year-old. When he went back to Argentina, he decided to shed his fake identity. He went to the German embassy and reclaimed his name and said, I was living here under this name, Helmut Gregor, but my real name is Joseph Mengele. And he got a German passport, and he then married his second wife and felt pretty comfortable. But right after his marriage in the summer of 1958, he learned that there was some interest evolving in him in the German league prosecutorial community, in the German justice community. Some policemen came to the town, which was sort of dominated by his family, and started asking questions. And by end of August of 1958, Mengele learned that there was interest in him on the part of German authorities. So he decided he had to leave Argentina, because Argentina had technically had an extradition treaty with Germany, and it was possible, although it didn't happen that often, that he could be extradited if the Germans requested his extradition. So he went to Paraguay, and got through fraud a naturalized citizenship under the name of Jose Mengele, and tried to keep a relatively low profile, but and felt, I guess, reasonably secure there, because in Paraguay, if you were a citizen, which he was, you couldn't be extradited. So he felt he would be safe if the Germans wanted to extradite him. He couldn't be extradited. But once Adolf Eichmann was kidnapped in 1960, Mengele was long gone from Argentina. But when Eichmann was kidnapped, Mengele realized that he wasn't safe in Paraguay, because he could be captured and taken to Israel the way Eichmann was. So he then really went underground. He got another assumed name, and he went to a place that was very big. Brazil is a huge country, and where he really had very few footprints, and kind of went underground. He lived under an assumed name. He lived with families that kind of protected him and provided a kind of communication structure where he could keep in touch with his family. His family funded much of this. And through a bunch of trusted actors, he was able to live unmolested in Brazil, but it was not the life that we all had imagined. He was constantly worried about being captured by the Israelis, always looking over his shoulder. His health declined. He had a stroke in the last 2 years of his life. His teeth were falling out. He lived in a pretty kind of squalid environment. So it was nothing like, this image you get from the movies of him living in some kind of plantation, with dogs and jackboots and cigarette boats on the river and things like that, and beautiful women. It was a much different environment, and he died a kind of old man's death at the age of 68, which isn't that old, with living a pretty forlorn existence, I guess.
All right, before we get to the last audience question, I just want to say thank you to everyone who submitted questions. Unfortunately, we can't get to all of them, but I appreciate your support and attention for this program. Last question. if there was no Nazis or war, what do you think Mengele would have been professionally?
If there wasn't, what's the beginning of the question?
If it wasn't no Nazis of war,
Right.
what do you think Mengele would have done professionally?
I think he would have been a professor and maybe the head of a laboratory or an institute. He would have maybe succeeded his mentor, a man named Otto von Verschuer, who was the head of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin, might have succeeded him. He certainly was interested in an academic career. We know that, we'll believe that much of the research he conducted at Auschwitz was likely in service of him getting his habilitation, which is a kind of postdoctoral certification in Germany to allow you to have an academic career. And I think that's probably what would have happened to him.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Dr. Marwell.
My pleasure.
It was great reading your book.
Thank you. It's obvious that you read it. Your questions were quite good.
Yeah, it was one of the first 2 books I was given when I started here 6 months ago. And
Good.
yeah, I couldn't wait to do this with you. I had a lot of questions.
So I wanted to offer, Raheem, if you wanted to give my website address, which is David G. Marwell, no spaces or punctuation, davidgmarwell.com. There's a place there where you can contact me. And if you have questions that I wasn't able to answer tonight or any comments, I'd welcome them. I can't promise to get back to you right away, but I try to answer every communication that comes my way. So I'd be happy to do that.
Yes, give me 1 second. I'm actually getting the link. I want to drop it in the chat right now.
Okay.
All right. Yes, so if you have any questions, please submit them to Dr. Marwell. And until next time, please also take a moment to fill out the links in the chat. There's a survey. We would love your feedback on how we can improve our programming. We would love to know what you think about tonight's program. Also, there's a link to our upcoming programs. We have a bunch of cool stuff coming up, especially this fall. We have a sneak peek screening of the Auschwitz report. We have our Rise Up exhibition coming up in October. We will have in-person and hybrid programs. So there's a bunch of stuff to look at throughout the rest of 2021 and going into 2022. Thank you for your time tonight, and I hope to see you all in the next program.